Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you to the Philosophy of Science group in India, for inviting me to give this talk, and to Tarun Menon for arranging it. What I want to do today is talk to you about trust in scientific evidence. So I'm from Michigan State University. My name is Heather Douglas, and this is the rough outline of the talk. First, I want to talk about the state of trust in science. Then we'll talk about grounding trust in science, the nature of expertise and how expertise is essential for the assessments of scientific evidence, the nature of the scientific community and the expert community, and how much that is important to grounding trust. In addition, the scientific experts' values, I will argue, is super important to the grounding of trust, and then I will draw general conclusions. So first, the state of trust in science. What is the state of trust in science? The good news is that generally, when people do surveys, for example, this is a survey of Americans done in January 2019, so before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, a year before, trust has gone up. Scientists are now trusted more than the military, than school principals, clearly more than politicians or elected officials, more than business leaders, more than the news media. So scientists are among the most trusted groups in America. This has actually been a fairly stable trend. So if you survey Americans, this is data going back from 1973 to 2016, where the previous data takes over. There's pretty stable trust in at least the community leaders of the scientific community. And this is not just an American phenomenon. In fact, recent data from Hanel and Mao asking people about trust in science the world over found that every country, the population is actually above the median, that most people trust science the world over. So there's a sense that there's, however, a crisis. And I think there are a number of causes for this crisis. Certainly things like the March for Science and the rise of alternative facts, the replication crisis, worries about the reliability of pharmaceutical research or research in agricultural sciences, particular locations of science. In addition, as you see in the upper left corner, that's the upper left corner for you, there are divergences between different political groups in how they trust science. So again, this is US data, and the red line are conservatives in the US, and you can see their trust declining dramatically over the period from the mid-70s to 2010. Or worries about the state of trust of vaccinations, particularly for the pandemic crisis. It's lower than the feelings of distrust in the safety of vaccines is at least below 33% everywhere. These are the top countries of distrust. But the fact that there is such a substantial portion that distrusts vaccines worries public health officials greatly. Now, the COVID-19 crisis has shifted this somewhat. It looks like, at least this is data from the UK, that people are beginning to trust experts who are speaking to them about the crisis, that scientific expertise has come to the fore more. But there are still these undercurrents that people worry a great deal about. And that's why we have to think more carefully about what grounds trust in science and scientific evidence. So what should ground trust in science? We should start with the question of why should we trust science? Because science is not always right. There are plenty of cases in the history of science, even in the history of recent science, where scientists have been very wrong about things. For example, diethylstilbestrol in the 1940s and 50s, when scientists thought it was a good way to control morning sickness. In fact, it caused birth defects. A lot of experts in the 1970s argued that nuclear reactor meltdowns weren't possible in water reactors, and didn't really believe that the 3 Mile Island reactor in the US had had a meltdown until robotic cameras got inside the reactor and showed that, in fact, there had been meltage of the reactor. Or if you look at the case of the causation of stomach ulcers and the difficulty of getting scientists to grapple with evidence that there was a bacterial cause and it wasn't just stress and diet. Or if you take a current case, we keep hearing about the technical feasibility of fusion energy, and for my entire lifetime, it's been 20 years out, and I'm over 50. So this is not great for the sort of projections of scientists. However, even when science is not fully accurate and scientists get stuff wrong, it can still be importantly informative for our reasoning. And science also sometimes tells us things we don't want to hear, or news that is unwelcome. For example, there's a pandemic coming. So it's really important to actually have sort of a sense of what it is that we're after when we argue for trust in science. So what does it mean to trust science? I think that it should mean we should listen to science and scientists, in particular, scientific experts, to help us make decisions. But we don't just want reliance on science. We don't just want it to be like a mechanical process. I think we want that thicker trust relationship that Annette Beyer began to work, sort of, I'm drawing from here. This entails a belief that the trusted party will act on our behalf with our interests in mind. Reliance might be, I might be relying upon the internet, for example, or my computer to record this talk properly and to get it to you to share properly, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I trust the internet. Believing a trust relationship is more than just reliance. It involves this thicker sense of the processes will be acting on our behalf, or the person will be acting on our behalf. So this means in part that scientists should be pursuing projects that are in the public interest, not against it. And we've seen controversies about this come up in terms of facial recognition software, who gets to use it for what purposes, the use of artificial intelligence, the use of policing algorithms. There are concerns about whether or not particular projects that scientists might be pursuing, in these cases in computer science, that might actually be against the public interest. So I think it's helpful to think of trust in science as something that entails a prima facie yet defeasible sense of the epistemic worth of science, its general reliability, at least that it's the best available epistemic understanding that we have at any given time, even if it might prove wrong, and that it is done in the public interest. So how do we ground this kind of trust in science? What serves as a basis? Because we don't want to just say, trust us without sort of any basis. We don't want to, have blind trust. But there's a real deep epistemic gap, a problem in grounding this sort of trust, because the non-expert cannot fully assess the expert and their expertise. That's part of what it means to be a non-expert, is you are not inside the epistemic discourse that the expert is part of. And the non-expert also cannot fully assess the scientific data. So if you just put all your data on the internet, which doesn't work when you have privacy issues for human subjects, but you put all the data on the internet and let people look at it, very often it's just reams of numbers. It doesn't actually help people assess it, or even if it's qualitative data, it's just mountains of words. In addition, past success of science generally cannot ground trust in science. And this is partly because the success was not uniform. There are failures, failures across ranges of disciplines. And so one might wonder whether or not the situation one's in now involves scientific failure or success. And then there's the problem that present science and expertise is usually, very often, not the same as past science and expertise. And so one is relying on, say, on different experts talking about different evidence for different issues. So past success by itself doesn't ground trust. So we can't have a full expert-to-expert assessment that might ground trust, and we can't just say past track record. So what should ground it? First, I think it's important to realize that Trust in scientific evidence is really based on trust in scientific expertise. That expertise is required for the scientific data gathering process. Ooh, required, whoops. Expertise is needed for the framing of questions, the proper use of methodology, the proper use of equipment, curation of data, and the interpretation of the evidence. Now, I'm not saying that only traditionally trained experts can do proper, good scientific data collection. Very often, citizen scientists are able to ask questions and pursue methodologies that produce just as reliable knowledge, either with or without the initial help of traditionally trained scientific experts. So this is not something that only traditionally trained scientific experts should be trusted to do, as I'll talk about in a little bit. But some expertise is needed, and when citizen scientists or community groups doing science develop their own pursuit of scientific knowledge, they often develop a great deal of expertise about the kind of evidence that they want to collect. So we really are talking about trust in scientific expertise when we talk about trust in science. So here are some answers that have been given to what might ground trust in science. Some have emphasized institutional markers, such as have you earned a PhD from a reputable university? Do you have publications in the right kind of places? Have you received awards for your work? I'm going to raise some concerns about those being the ground of trust in science, although I'll argue they're important in some sense. Some authors like Elizabeth Anderson here have argued that scientific consensus is a main way to ground trust. She writes, before a consensus, the best course for the layperson is to suspend judgment. Once a consensus of trustworthy experts is consolidated, laypersons are well advised to accept the consensus. And other folks have suggested that scientific method is in fact the thing to emphasize. I'm going to suggest here that these are inadequate answers. Institutional markers, I think, are neither necessary nor sufficient for trustworthy expertise. There are people who don't have the traditional background and training, don't have a PhD, who prove to be incredibly reliable experts. And there are people who are traditionally trained who prove to be not very trustworthy or reliable experts. Scientific consensus is helpful. I will show exactly how, but it can still be untrustworthy because, for example, in the case of diethylstilbestrol, it was a consensus among many scientists that it was a useful and safe drug to take. That consensus began to be eroded by the mid to late 1950s, but it took a fair amount of effort to really push scientists away from that. Or if you think about the consensus around ulcer formation, very strong consensus, not properly formed. So there are all kinds of things that can impede the proper formation of consensus. I think it's also a practical mistake to emphasize the need for consensus for two reasons. The first being that the public cannot wait for consensus in many cases. Scientific consensus can be slow to form, and we don't want to say, just suspend judgment, don't act until consensus is formed. In addition, if you argue that you shouldn't trust until consensus forms, it incentivizes interested actors to forestall the formation of consensus, so do what they can to keep consensus from forming. So I think that consensus, while helpful, and I'll explain later in the talk exactly how it's helpful, is not the mark of trust in science. And for the concerns about scientific method, I recommend looking at Naomi Oreskes' book, Why Trust Science, for why this is not an adequate approach. So an alternative approach that I will be laying out today is that we should do three things. First, you have to detect the presence of expertise, and I'll talk about how one does that without being an expert. Second, to assess the functioning of the expert's epistemic community. and I'll talk about how that should be done and what kind of markers for good functioning one should look for. And the third is to assess the values of the expert. So this approach allows one to assess individual experts for trustworthiness without requiring the same expertise of the assessor and without waiting for consensus. Okay. So how do we assess the presence of expertise, and what is this thing, expertise? I think we should think of expertise as a fluency of judgment in a particular domain. So this doesn't mean that the expert is always right or has all the answers or knows the truth, but they understand what the key aspects and issues are in a domain and are thus able to ask the crucial questions to understand what kinds of methodologies are reliable or not, what the kinds of problems might be with methodologies. It's this kind of fluency of judgment that makes expertise expertise. And I think we are each experts in some domains and non-experts in many, many others. I know this doesn't look like a spectrum, it looks like a dichotomy, but imagine that this is a spectrum. PowerPoint is kind of hard to make this clear on. So there's different kinds of expertise. Some expertise is very what you might call success accessible. So success is clear and it's short term, and you can see whether or not success exists. For example, chess players. We know who the best chess players in the world are because they win the chess games against the other best chess players of the world. Or we know who the best Go players are because they win the games. We also might know who the expert car mechanics are because they fix our cars successfully and the car runs for a fair amount of time afterwards. We know who the best athletes are because they have success in competition. Aristotle mentioned that, we know who the good cooks are because the meal is great, even if we couldn't possibly replicate it ourselves. And John Dewey talks about shoemakers, that we know a good shoemaker because, frankly, we wear the shoe and it feels good. Then there are experts where success is not so easy to assess. And it is these kinds of experts that are the ones that are really contested in our public discourse. So we think about climate modelers. Eventually we'll know whether or not the projections made by climate modelers are reliable. But by that time, we'll have missed the window for action. Same thing for epidemiologists attempting to assess long-term health impacts. Very often there are so many confounders in real populations that, even if epidemiologists make a recommendation, whether or not it was their recommendation that improved public health outcomes can be hard or difficult to assess. And so success is not quite so easy to assess. Toxicologists, field biologists, molecular biologists. And we might think about epidemiologists as doing with pandemic research as being in the middle, sort of in between these two. So there's plenty of experts that are neither super success accessible, easy to assess in terms of success, nor really difficult. They might be sort of mid-range. And if you think about your relationship to your physician, you do want to follow the advice of your expert physician. Sometimes whether or not their advice is working or not can be hard to assess in the medium term, but you get some sense of whether or not, say, issues are being resolved over periods of months. That's the same kind of possibility of assessment that we have now for epidemiologists in the midst of a pandemic. Does following their advice successfully flatten the curve? Are we reducing transmission rates? And so there we do have kind of a mid-range. It takes a couple of months and we might have forgotten what they actually projected by the time we get to the assessment, but there is a possibility for success assessment in the medium term. And that's why there's a spectrum. Expertise kinds of smears up along this sort of range. Now, just to go back, For experts who are easy to assess success, we can just select experts who are successful. That's relatively straightforward. In the medium term, we might be willing to wait for success, but we also might need to make decisions about what to do before even we allow the months to go by to allow us for medium-term assessment. And then for the long-term cases, we really can't wait for all the data to come in for us to figure out whether or not their projections were right and whether or not we can actually separate them from the other confounders that might be going on. So what should we expect from this kind of expertise if we can't use success as the key measure of the presence of expertise? And here I want to draw from the work of Julia Ennis, who wrote about moral expertise, that expertise requires that the expert, unlike the mere muddler or the person with the unintellectual knack, be able to give an account of what it is that she is expert in. The expert, but not the dabbler, can explain why she's doing what she's doing instead of being stuck with inarticulacy or being reduced to saying that it feels right this way. She can explain why this is, here and now, the appropriate thing to do in these circumstances. And if we think about, again, the spectrums of success, it is this kind of explanation that we desperately need in the cases where we can't just use success as the measure of expertise. So when epidemiologists and scientists began to explain to us what we need to do to flatten the curve, we needed the explanations of what it was that was going on and why their recommendations would plausibly work. Even more so with climate modeling, epidemiology for long-term impacts, and other long-term projection or complex system assessments. We don't need those kinds of assessments from chess players. Many chess players cannot explain how they won a game. Just the fact that they did is enough. Or a car mechanic may not be able to explain what their process was exactly. And the explanation of what was wrong might be rather thin, but that's okay because the car works. Once you get to areas of expertise where success is not so clear, the explanations, the explications of what is happening, of how one forms a judgment, become crucial. So, for experts whose success in the short term is readily accessible, measures of success suffice. These are not the experts we have debates about whether or not their expertise is trustworthy. For experts whose success in the short term is not readily accessible, they must be able to explicate or explain their judgments. And it's these experts who are often at the center of trust debates. Explaining judgment, I want to make clear, does not transmit the bulk of expertise or make one who hears the expert's explanation an expert. Demanding and receiving explanations doesn't turn the non-expert into an expert. Instead, and you can imagine, if you think about any time you've received such an explanation yourself, it does show the complexity with which the expert is grappling. Whenever I ask an expert to explain how they came to a judgment, I very often find that there are issues and factors I had never heard of, much less thought of, that have gone into the judgment. Nor is it a full accounting of everything the expert is thinking, but it is sort of the main line of reasoning that they are pursuing. It's for these reasons, I think, that explications show why expertise is essential to trust in scientific evidence, because once we start hearing these explications and these explanations of judgment, we realize how complex the territory is and why we need expertise in that territory. So that's one, that's detecting the presence of expertise, which I think can be done without becoming an expert oneself. The second thing to do is to assess the expert community that one's expert is interacting with. So this is where these institutional markers might actually be really helpful. So is the expert trained? Where? How? By whom? Degrees might be important. They might not be. Maybe it was an apprenticeship relationship. More important than particular background training is perhaps, because someone might be self-trained, Are they participating in an expert community? Are they interacting with peers in the field? Certainly, chess experts and Go experts are doing this. That's the people that they're playing against. But even especially for the experts that we need to demand explanations of, we want to know that they are engaged in debates with their expert community, which we can tell by publications in peer-reviewed journals, conference participation, prizes, grants. These are markers that there is engagement between an expert and a broader expert community. So I think, and it's important to realize that present interaction with an expert community is more important in these kinds of things than past training. So people might begin to eschew their past training or might not have had the kind of training that someone else might have, but might actually have become one of the central experts in the field. And then we should look as well on how that expert community is functioning. So Helen Longino, who I have an image of here, has really emphasized this in her work on social epistemology in science. Are there forums for exchanging ideas that are well known? Are different experts responding to criticism? This is crucial. Is there tempered intellectual equality? So are people allowed to join into the expert conversation, and regardless of their ethnicity or gender or age are taken seriously? Even if maybe someone who has more experience, you sort of weight their expertise slightly higher, but there should be a rough intellectual equality within the expert community. There need to be shared standards for, of course, for this debate to be ongoing, and those shared standards need to be part of what gets debated occasionally. You want diversity in that community to ensure that various kinds of approaches and background assumptions get unearthed and a range of views to be considered. This, I think, is what Elizabeth Anderson is also talking about in displaying dialogic rationality, but that's more about sort of responding to criticism and perhaps, including uptake of criticism. Now, this issue of criticism is crucial because, the quip is all professions are conspiracies against the laity. We don't want the experts to be viewed as a group that just kind of has its own cabal of protecting its own expertise. So one crucial issue is, how does the expert community respond to criticism, including being open to outside criticism? So it's really important when criticism is raised of particular work that's done within an expert community or of a body of knowledge that comes from outside, that the fellow experts not just leap to the expert's defense who's being criticized, because sometimes, experts get things wrong. Sometimes there is misbehavior of experts. For example, in the L'Aquila 2009 flawed earthquake risk assessment, there were risk assessors who did not do their job properly. They allowed a public official to say something that was patently false, which was that tremors released energy and reduced the risk of earthquake. It was known that was not true of the region. People who heard that statement changed their patterns of behavior, died as a result, and the experts didn't correct the public official's statement when they were brought in specifically to advise them. Now, the rest of the scientific community, when those risk assessors were charged with negligence of duty and the manslaughter that resulted from them, with saying this was like a Galileo sort of inquisition, and we shouldn't allow this to happen, and you can't predict earthquakes. But that wasn't what the problem was with the experts' behavior. And the sort of brouhaha in the international sphere really just showed a terrible tendency of experts to do this sort of protect our own first. That cannot be the behavior of experts in the face of criticism that comes from outside the expert community. Now, not every expert needs to respond to every criticism. So this can be done in a communal way. And I recommend looking at websites like realclimate.org, where criticisms are taken seriously of climate science, but not every expert has to respond to every criticism, but every criticism needs some response so that there's a continual sense of taking seriously criticism, responding to it, perhaps even changing what one is doing in the face of it. So, in sum, on the expert community, the expertise requires a peer community, whether it's easy to assess in terms of success or not. So having an expert peer community in some sense hones one's expertise. The public does need to know whether an expert community is functioning well as an epistemic community. Is there appropriate diversity in the community? Are there fora for discussions and critiques? Is there uptake of criticism from within and from outside? And it's these sorts of markers that one can actually find regarding any expert community. So expert communities should be sure to display some of their communal epistemic functioning, including the presence of debate and the presence of response to criticism. Now, this means that the public can assess community functioning and criticize it, for example, for not having sufficient diversity, which is a criticism that has been raised of, say, computer science, without having the same expertise. Okay, so that's crucial for any grounding of trust. The final aspect of area to ground trust, I will argue, is the particular scientific expert's values. And the reason we have to assess a particular scientific expert's values is because we can't wait for consensus in many cases, nor do we want to valorize or to make trusting in science depend upon the achievement of consensus for reasons I discussed earlier. So that means sometimes we have to select which experts to trust. So, I have a recap here. We can assess the presence of expertise without being experts. The experts must be engaged with a well-functioning expert community. But we also want to, if we have disagreement among experts, we need experts to show commitment to important values. One of those values is the value of inquiry itself. And the second is shared social and ethical values with the public. So let me talk about each of these in turn. The two values, valuing inquiry and shared social and ethical values. Valuing inquiry means having the proper regard for evidence. So no fraud, no cherry picking. People are actually responsive to evidential concerns and empirical issues. And this also means properly responding to criticism. So experts should change their mind when new evidence is presented that challenges their views, or be able to explain why the new evidence does not change their mind, perhaps because they're seriously worried about some methodological flaw. In addition, experts should also be able to say what evidence would change their mind. So it can't be some insurmountable bar, and scientific experts should never say things like, no evidence will change my mind, because then they have left the realm of scientific empirical inquiry. So this is displayed by dialogical responsiveness and rationality, and you might think of valuing inquiry as, in a sense, having scientific integrity. So how do you detect a lack of integrity? I have written about this kind of case in Bullshit and Philosophy, which is a super fun examination of how things go horribly wrong in some cases. An expert who lacks this valuing of inquiry, who lacks scientific integrity, will ignore inconvenient evidence when it suits them, cherry pick evidence, depend upon known flawed evidence, not be able to imagine evidence that will change their mind, and not respond to criticism. So lack of integrity is discovered in a pattern of argumentation, and it can be detected without having to be an expert in the field itself, just by watching the expert engage with other experts. In addition to this valuing of inquiry, it's also super important that the experts that we choose to trust have the same social ethical values that we do. And this is because there are at least two crucial places for values in science. I say at least because there are actually several more, but I'm just going to rely, for the sake of argument, on these two. Values direct the efforts of scientists, so they help direct the attention of scientists to particular questions and to particular hypotheses. And so we might be concerned, are experts asking the right questions that we think are central to the issues that the expert should be addressing? Are the right range of hypotheses being considered? In addition, values to help decide what counts as sufficient evidence. So when is the evidence that has been gathered for a hypothesis or a theory enough, strong enough? Epistemic values are useful in assessing the strength of the evidence, but don't address what counts as sufficient evidence. So this rests on the issue of how much uncertainty we are willing to accept in a particular context for a particular claim, and which errors are more important to us, making a claim prematurely, a false positive, or failing to make a claim in sufficient time, a false negative. This is where social and ethical values play an absolutely crucial role in scientific expert judgment. So we can think about values in the research agenda in more depth. There are cases where we might have real worries about the social and ethical values that direct our attention and frame research questions. So we might worry about, say, commercial interests directing scientists' attention to patentable outcomes. We might worry about scientists looking at using methodologies that allow them to actually ignore what is a serious issue. For example, doing toxicological studies with a particular time frame that is short enough to not have various kinds of toxic effects that the public would be concerned about arise. So, Jim Brown has argued that patentable pharmaceutical treatment gets an emphasis of attention, but non-patentable dietary or exercise change might actually be more effective for human health in some cases, for changes in human health. Maya Goldenberg has argued that scientists are not so great at tracking and studying the causes of rare adverse reactions to vaccines. And so this creates a condition of vaccine hesitancy, which is a little different than vaccine denialism. And then there are the sort of worries that Jacob Stegenga has raised about the ability of our medical research system to properly study the side effects of medical interventions. So interaction with, and sometimes collaboration with, relevant publics can help shape research agendas to be sure that the questions being asked are ones that the public views as central, as well as being informed by the expertise of scientists to pursue, work that can be done. Not every question that the public wishes could be answered can be answered by the available methodologies of the time. And then there's an issue of values and evidential sufficiency. So whenever we have some evidence for a scientific claim, we have to address the question, how much evidence is enough? We need some evidence, but the question of evidential sufficiency is answered differently by different scientists and different publics on different issues at different times. So at particular points of time, we might have a range of expert opinion on particular claims. So different scientists assess evidential sufficiency differently. Currently, there are no scientists that I know of that don't think smoking is dangerous, but in the 1950s, it was still an open question, and different scientists at different times found the evidence sufficient. Or you take acid rain in the 1970s, or climate change in the 1980s, or the threat of neonicotinoid pesticides to pollinators in the past decade. There's always this question of, is the evidence we have currently sufficient to support a claim that might actually change policy, or that people should take seriously in making their decisions about what to do? So what we are willing to risk with uncertainties, this is shaped by our social and ethical political values. And what is central for trust is to find experts who would make the judgments you would if you had their expertise. This means finding experts who have similar social and ethical values that are at the moment of judgment of evidential sufficiency, and asking the kinds of questions you would. So how much would you be willing to risk error in this particular case? And is the expert that you are going to trust making the same kind of judgment? This kind of consilience between the values of you and the expert is crucial for you to trust that the expert has your interests at heart, which we talked about at the beginning is central to trust. So the values, the social and ethical values, and the value of inquiry are going to matter. In conditions of disagreement among experts, we want to trust experts who value inquiry and who share your political, social, and ethical values, because then they will make judgments about evidential sufficiency as you would. In conditions of consensus among experts, which when we've got it, that's great, we have to make sure that it's a consensus among trustworthy experts, and trustworthy experts must value inquiry and have that scientific integrity. If there is a diversity of trustworthy experts reaching consensus, this means that the consensus has been reached, including experts who likely share your values and concerns. So then you don't have to worry about finding a particular expert who shares your values and concerns. It's likely that it has already been taken into account. And this is why consensus is a helpful indicator for trust, but isn't itself, the sole basis. So we should trust experts who would make judgments about the research and available evidence the way we would if we were experts with integrity. This means that it's really important to assess experts' values. We have to be sure that we are trusting experts who value inquiry, who have scientific integrity, and it's useful to have experts show that they share our social and ethical values, because then when we have consensus, we can know that they are part of that consensus, and when there's dissensus, we know which experts we should trust. This means in cases of dissensus, trust in individual experts will not be universal. Some groups will trust some experts more than others. Okay, almost done. So how should we ground trust in scientific expertise? First, I argued that trust in scientific evidence requires trust in scientific expertise. So we're really talking about trust in scientific expertise. There are 3 moves to make. First, we make sure that there's expertise present in our chosen either expert community or individual experts we want to trust. Then we have to assess the functioning of the expert community, including how well it responds to criticism that comes from both within and without. And finally, we need to assess the expert's values. Do they respect inquiry, and do they share our other values? I think the virtues of this approach is it shows clearly that we can assess experts for trustworthiness without becoming experts. We don't have to have the same fluency of judgment. We don't have to know everything the expert knows. The evidence that experts produce can thus be assessed for trustworthiness. In addition, I think this approach shows what both experts and non-experts should be expected to do, and it clarifies what is expected of them. So experts have to be able to explicate their judgment and to show respect for inquiry and be engaged in expert community, and non-experts can track responsiveness to criticism, the proper concern for inquiry, and the recognition of important values. There are, however, costs to this approach. I think we should have to give up on the expectation of universally trustworthy scientific expertise in all cases. That in cases where there is genuine dissensus, not everyone's going to trust maybe our expert that we find trustworthy. So we can still have expertise we can still have universally trustworthy expertise in some cases. When you have readily accessible success about which the public cares, So, are you worried about an expert who produces, is the new gadget reliable? Well, you can just tell it works. So, and the public cares about its success, readily accessible. Or if you have a strong, properly formed consensus among diverse experts, you can have universally trustworthy expertise. But we should neither demand nor wait for such markers. Expertise is not, because it's really impractical, and because very often we have to make decisions ahead of time. In addition, we have to give up the idea that expertise is generally value-free or politically neutral. That's not what expertise is, even if it's super valuable for both epistemic reasons and for our own guidance and decision-making. And because of its value, we still need trustworthy expertise and good governance. So I want to thank you for listening to this, and I look forward to our Q&A session.
So yeah, thank you for that excellent talk, and I'm sure there's going to be a very productive discussion, because this is something that, especially now, a lot of us are thinking about and worrying about. I will open up the floor to discussion without much more delay, but let me also mention that if you have a question or a comment that you'd like to make, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. You can access that by going to the participant list, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then on the participant list, there should be a raise hand function. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I would request you to keep it to one question at a time. If you have a second question you'd like to ask, please raise your hand again, and I'll cycle back to you once we're out of questions. Finally, before opening it up to quick plug for this lecture series, where you can find out about future lectures of the series, as well as signing up for the mailing list, where we'll keep you informed about future lectures. I've linked the website on the chat. You can also see videos of past lectures, and eventually in a couple of days. All right, with all that said, please, if you have a question, please go ahead and raise your hand using the Zoom function, and I will call on you. Okay. All right, so while people maybe ponder their questions, we already have one, so maybe, okay. Prashant, do you want to ask a question? Go ahead. Please unmute your mic.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, that was a wonderful talk. I had basically 3 questions, but like you said, probably one question at a time. So I'll begin with the first question that I had. The kind of methodology that you have described, ma'am, is really nice. But what I was wondering about is what to do when there's a question of an algorithm. Basically, what happens, like a lot of times when we have to make decisions, especially in terms of public policy, it becomes more about whose model is superior. You see, for example, a pandemic, the kind of modeling tools or equipments or the algorithms that are used become the central question in terms of trust. So whose algorithm do we trust? Do we trust this person's algorithm or that person's algorithm? I mean, at least in the example that you made of the computer playing chess, so probably you could think of it in this way, that, okay, fine, we don't have algorithms which have already played a lot of chess matches. They don't have much data to infer from, but it's rather 2 computers, let us say, with very minimal experience in playing chess, but now you have to choose between them, because that's what the pandemic situation more or less is like. You don't have much past data to rely upon.
Okay, so actually, I thought a bit about this and talked about this in a couple places. I do think that this approach works as well for algorithms and for neural net computer science. And I think you can use the same sort of standards. So, does your algorithm have success? Or if it's not so clear, how successful it's going to be, can you explicate the judgments that guide success? So one of the things that's been controversial in the US is the use of algorithms, for example, to help inform parole decisions. And one of the difficulties of using algorithms to inform parole decisions is, number one, the algorithms that have been used have been, in some cases, proprietary. So the internal reasoning of the algorithm is not publicly available and open to critique. So that sort of fails in the expert community category. In addition, you can measure success in one direction. If you release someone, do they recommit or not? Do they end up back in prison or not? But you can't assess success in the other direction. You can't assess whether or not if someone would have been released, but you didn't release them, they would have ended up back in the prison system or not. So there's a whole direction that is unaccessible in terms of success, which means you have to have the explication of judgment, and you need to know that the algorithm was built with the right sort of social and ethical values in mind. Are you considering the costs of keeping someone in prison who, would be not a threat to society, and restricting their freedom properly? Or are you only considering, sort of one direction evaluation? And one of the problems with these algorithms is it turns out that they're actually quite racist. So a lot of the sort of predictions that they make are based on things like income and, sort of the zip code they come from. And there's a lot of segregation in the US system. So, there have been a lot of analyses of the work that these algorithms have done and found them to be really problematic. So the sort of issues that I talked about can work for an algorithm. Can you assess success? If not, can you find out what's going on? And this is, I think, one of the reasons why when you have neural net systems in non-success accessible locations, like neural net systems are fantastic for, say, assessing tissue slides for cancer, right? Fantastic, because then you can actually assess success relatively easily. Do they do it right or not? And you can do that with the trajectory of the health of the person. But in cases that are more murky, it ends up being really sort of problematic. And then people worry about, how do we unpack the judgment that the neural net system is making? That's actually a big part of the sort of worry in computer science right now, because if you don't have success accessibility, God, I have to have a better word for that. It's so hard to say. Then you need to actually get at, the judgments that are being made. And then you also need to be assured that these systems are being constructed within an expert community that is diverse and has the right sort of values being expressed at least some of the time by some of the practitioners. And then you need, the right kind of discourse. So all of the sort of same issues arise for the assessments of algorithms and models, I think.
Okay, thanks. Prashant, since you have other questions, maybe you can raise your hand again on Zoom, and I will come back to you once we get through the remaining questions.
Thank you.
Yeah. Siddharth, go ahead.
Hello, Professor Douglas. Thanks a lot for your... Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your really interesting lecture. My question, the impression I got was that the factors that you have considered, whether the fact that science could be wrong, or that there is consensus, or in certain questions there is no consensus, or the fact that claims are being made by people with institutional credentials and expertise, all of these pertain to the question of whether a scientific question is being answered correctly, or whether adequate justification has been provided. And depending on how they fare on these factors, there is an erosion or a buildup of trust in science. I was wondering what the role of the perceived or real overreach of science, of scientists or science communicators claiming to have solutions or addressing issues that might be perceived by the public as not being in the domains of science. The most common questions might be those pertaining to ethics or socio-political questions. So my larger question is, what role does the public perception of the domain or the boundaries of science, the public perception of what are and what are not scientific questions, what role does this play in the trust that the public has in science?
That's a great question. And I think this is part of the difficulty of how science is portrayed in our education systems. So if science is portrayed as the purveyor of empirical truth, if you have an empirical question, science has the empirical truth. That makes it very difficult to sort of understand properly the boundaries of science. I think the empiricism of it is central, but one of the things I think is really important is that science is a practice of inquiry, first and foremost, and of ongoing inquiry. So one of the sort of questions that sort of should bound science is not whether or not it produces truth, but is the question open to inquiry, an empirical inquiry? And there are lots of questions that are not open to empirical inquiry. My favorite example of questions that are not open to empirical inquiry are questions of faith. So, you know, the whole point of faith is to believe something in the face of evidence to the contrary. That's why you have to make a leap of faith. That's the whole point. So the idea that somehow science should be made to speak to these issues is, I think, a mistake. Very often, though, we have questions that some groups want to hold as a matter of faith, and some groups want to hold as a matter of empirical inquiry. And then you have a real conflict between the two. I mean, there are some areas of empirical inquiry we don't have any access to at the moment, like what happens when you die? I don't know how to investigate that. I don't know anyone who has a way to investigate that rigorously or carefully. Getting evidence is really tough. We know what happens to the body, but that's not what people are concerned about. So this becomes like an issue where science doesn't really have a way of speaking to it. And I think demanding that it speak to all issues is a mistake. What I'm sort of more worried about in trust in science is when it's not so much about the question that is asked, but very often the sort of level of confidence that sometimes gets portrayed in science communication. Like, we know that drinking a glass of red wine is good for you, until a few years later when we decide that actually drinking a glass of red wine all the time is no different than drinking a glass of beer. Except that maybe actually it turns out that there is no safe dose or like beneficial dose of alcohol, that there was a confounder all along. That's apparently where we are now, but you know, this sort of statement of very clear result that often happens in science journalism or among some scientists when they know that there are confounders, when they know that it's an ongoing inquiry. And so sort of saying like, you know, based on this study, what we have now, this is what we think, we'll continue to study it, that's probably a more plausible and moderate way to communicate in the sort of public sphere. And so that actually should probably help build trust in science. I also think that we should, because science is a practice of inquiry as opposed to like a foundational truth issue, teach science as something that can always overturn itself in any given area.
Okay, thank you. Ravit, you have a question?
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it. So my question is about, I really like the point about we can't wait for consensus that's just gonna take too long. And so you said when we don't have this consensus available, we're gonna need to trust those individual scientists. And then you brought up the question, well, okay, how do we do that? But I was kind of wondering whether it is going to be the individual scientists, or is it going to be subgroups of scientists? And so you'll have labs or something, and that it's not individuals, but rather subgroups. So I was kind of wondering what you thought about that. And I don't know if it's going to make any difference to your account at all. But I was just kind of curious to see how you think about that.
Yeah. So yeah, it can either be individuals. So there are some cases where I know of a climatologist who is an evangelical Christian, and it's her that is trusted by evangelical churches on climate science in the US. So sometimes it is very much an individual scientist who sort of puts themselves out there to communicate with a particular community, but just as much it could be, say, a subgroup, a particular lab, a particular sort of group of collaborators that is making judgments the way you feel you would, that has sort of shared values, and then you might trust that group as being particularly trustworthy. So I'm happy with either one, but yeah, I think it's really important not to sort of either push for waiting for consensus or to hold that as the standard, because that really sort of incentivizes the sort of undermining of consensus. Then, like, you know, people, all they do is like stop consensus, and they can forestall action, which I think is a mistake.
Okay, Jyoti?
Hello, hello, Professor. Thanks for the talk. So if we talk about objectivity in science, there are at least like 7 normatively acceptable bases for objectivity. And if I talk specifically about detached objectivity, because that is where an expert should not be hogging upon some kind of past belief, because doing that will not make something true. Yeah. So, or turning a blind eye to an unpleasant evidence. So, so this sort of like detached objectivity sort of points us towards value-free objectivity, and the line is blurred.
So you want me to see if I can differentiate this?
A sort of distinction would help.
Yeah. So yeah, this sounds familiar. I think it's from Douglas 2004. Thank you
Objectivity in science.
Using me to talk about, to critique me. That's fantastic. Yeah, so the sense of detached objectivity in that paper and in the book that I want to use is the same kind of objectivity that I want to see for scientific integrity, for having the value of inquiry. It's being open to new evidence. It's being willing to give up one's ideas of what is the case if, you know, new evidence comes in that really should confront one's views. And so that, I think, is super important. But given the importance of values in setting what counts as enough evidence, I think that we always have to have some values involved. And this can be tricky for the individual scientist, or for assessing the individual scientist, or for even assessing a group of scientists. But I think that the way to do this is in terms of the scientists' responses to criticism. So are they responsive to criticism? When new evidence arises, do they take it seriously? Do they change their mind? Do they say, you know, oh, okay, well, this time, maybe I'm not so convinced by this evidence because I don't think they controlled for this confounder, or the methodology was flawed. But if they did it this way, then I would perhaps be more persuaded. And then if that actually happens, do they then take it on board, right? Because, you know, what you can't have is a continually moving bar. I think that's when the line gets blurred. It's when the bar keeps getting stricter and stricter and stricter because I don't want to give up the view that they have. So I think it's just to be discovered in a pattern of behavior, and that way we don't have to, like, you know, unpack what's going on in the inner mind, because that's too hard. But I think that's actually where we find the line between detached objectivity and the sort of value-free ideal that I don't think we can actually hold up as an ideal.
So definitely, thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jyoti. Deepika, you have a question?
Yes. Hi. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Professor Douglas. It was a great talk. I had a question, and like an offshoot of that question, and it's related to the question that Ravit asked you just before the last question. So I'm sure you've responded to this multiple times, but if you could shed some light on how do you figure out the social, ethical, and political values of scientists, when certainly, either they are working in institutions which are funded by the government or by private entities. So what are those values, or what are those markers of their values that we are looking for, or that we should look for as laypersons? And secondly, while you were responding to Ravit's question, you said, there are sometimes ways where we just feel like there are sometimes instances when we just feel that we should listen to this expert. So, I mean, when we feel that we should listen to this expert over the other one, is it are our values aligning with them, or can we understand this feeling of correspondence, or this feeling of matched interests in terms of same values or similar values? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I do think that when we find an expert trustworthy, part of it is a sense that we share their concerns, or that they share our concerns. And this can happen either at the sort of big communication scale. So I'm thinking of like Anthony Fauci in the US. He became like the trusted face of the COVID-19 pandemic earlier this spring, when we desperately needed a trusted face of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the things that he did was express concern for human life, for protecting human life. While he said, like, look, we don't want to, restrict people's freedoms unnecessarily, but here, given what we know about the virus at this point in time, and given what we sort of project about what would happen if we didn't act, and given the value that we have in human life, here's what we should do. And so there is an expression of values very often in the communications of experts. They will say what they're trying to protect. They're saying what they're concerned with. And, versus an expert's like, well, I only care about the economy or keeping business open. At which point in time, I'd be like, run away. Like, this is not the expert to believe in, because they sort of don't share the kind of values that I have. Now, other people might be like, oh, well, that is the expert I want to listen to. It turns out that you should protect human life and the economy simultaneously. That's really crucial, that the two are deeply entangled. And people went back to look at the flu of 1918 to discover that the places that did the best were the ones that were both human health protective and they did the best economically. So, a lot of people said this is a false choice. But I think in terms of your question, it is when experts tell us the things that drive them. Why is it the expert is studying this? What do they care about? And this is an expression of values that either we find ourselves sympathetic with, and so they feel trustworthy, or we find ourselves not sympathetic with, and so they don't feel trustworthy. So I actually think that they tell us.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Deepika. Don has a question. Go ahead, Don.
Yeah. Hi. So in the first part of your argument on expertise, when you said, one of the markers that we should be looking at is the ability of experts to give an account. Do you have a model of explanation when an expert explains something? Do you have a model of explanation? Because I was thinking how it differs from the third part when you say, experts should have values of inquiry related to scientific integrity. So someone could say, yeah, being able to give an explanation is part of having a value for inquiry. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Yeah. So I'm not thinking of like the philosophical models of scientific explanation that I talked about. I have a 2009 paper on prediction and explanation. I'm not thinking like you should either have like a hypothetical deductive model of explanation or a unifying explanation. When an expert is explaining their judgment, very often it's a matter of narrative. So, for example, when someone's explaining why they think climate change is anthropogenic, it's just like, okay, so temperatures are rising. Why is it humans? They should probably talk about key, markers of anthropogenic causation, like, we have been going through several cycles of sun intensity waxing and waning, and the temperature has not dropped when the sun intensity has dropped. Instead, it's, at best, the temperature sort of stopped rising as quickly. This indicates that the forcing is not from the sun. Or, why did temperature drop between 1940 and 1970? Because of sulfate aerosols. And we know that because our models did really well when we had a volcanic eruption in 1991, and the models were used to predict global temperatures for the year following, and they did great. And so that actually indicates why temperature dropped, even though greenhouse gases were rising to 1940, 1970. But temperature, should have been rising because greenhouse gases were rising. It's because sulfate or aerosols were being pumped out at a high rate, and that was for cooling the planet. And then we discovered acid rain, and we scrubbed the sulfates out of the smokestack, and sulfate levels dropped in the upper atmosphere, and so the climate signal reappeared. So it's this sort of narrative that is sort of an indication of what is the sort of lines of inquiry, the lines of evidence, how they fit together, what kinds of things have been taken into account. These are not sort of what I would consider internal scientific explanations in the sort of formal sense of a scientist talking to each other. But I think that it's those sort of narratives that show arcs of inquiry, lines of reasoning, and show sort of the complexity of the judgments, of the things that the expert is taking into account. And so that's the kind of thing that I think is really helpful for people to hear. So if we take, again, COVID-19, you know, the narratives around mask wearing, like, why are we wearing masks given that, you know, they're terrible at like letting the air in from the side. So when we're breathing, like the masks aren't actually that protective for us. So why wear them? And, you know, the narratives around, well, the production of small aerosols, in particular aerosols that can linger in the air for a long time. The discovery that it's not just particles that, you know, fall within 6 feet, but that the tiny ones that float around for hours, that those are the ones that when you're breathing get caught by the mask. And so what you're doing is keeping you from breathing out aerosol particles that might be infectious, particularly because we don't, very often in the early days of the disease, we don't know that we are sick, right? So there's this problem of, you know, you're infectious before you're symptomatic, which is a huge, huge problem. I mean, imagine how much easier this would be if you were only infectious when you were fully symptomatic. So much easier. So we have that, and then we have the fact that like these viruses travel on very tiny particles that last in the air a long time. And then all of a sudden, boom, the masks make a lot of sense. Like it's a general public health protective measure. So it's these kinds of narratives, this explanation of judgment that make a huge difference. Think also of how well experts were at explaining what flattening the curve was about this past spring and what that meant for health systems. Like the reason that we wanted to flatten the curve was not just to reduce the number of deaths, but to reduce the pressure on the hospitals. Oh, right. If the hospitals get overwhelmed, more people will die. Okay. So these sorts of explanations of what we were trying to do to slow the rate of infection was about flattening the curve to protect hospitals and protect hospital workers and protect systems from getting overwhelmed. It's this kind of explanation that I think is central to expert judgment and very often brings to our attention things that we wouldn't have thought of. And that for the expert, there's a whole mess of complicating things in the background of those things. They don't have to explain all of it. They're not trying to make us experts. They're trying to make clear why it is they think what they think, roughly. And so I think it's kind of a narrative process. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Shinod, you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk and an engaging discussion. And I have a couple of questions, but I will start with whether you stopped the aerosols and the use of masks. Initially, in the beginning of the pandemic, WHO advertised, instructed that not to use masks if you are not showing the symptoms. Part of the reason was at the time it was believed that asymptomatic patients won't transmit the virus. However, there was a study in January 30 published in New England Journal of Medicine from a group of scientists from Germany suggesting that they have reported that this is not the case. Asymptomatic patients are in fact transmitting the virus. So we should rethink our transmission dynamics. However, this study was vehemently criticized initially. For example, the Public Health Agency of Sweden said this is wrong. And the expert had a very divided opinion. Some even suggested that this is a group of people trying to push their idea given the publication pressure in the industry. However, and fine, this was a paper published in January 30. February 1st week, Science has a report on this saying that now that's a wrong idea to put forward. But in June, they updated the same report, suggesting that even though their paper was flawed, but now it is accepted that people with mild symptoms in fact transmit the virus. In between 6 months have passed. By that time, it is spread a lot. So I was looking at this episode for some time. That's where your study becomes quite important. This expertise and this divided opinion. In this particular case, it seems to me that even a precautionary principle would have helped us changing our understanding of transmission dynamics. But somehow the experts, the group, all these are experts, epidemiologists, virologists, all the people miss that point. Do you have any particular take on this kind of an issue? And it's a high risk scenario too. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, this is partly, I really think that the COVID-19 situation is a really great historical moment to be studying expertise, precisely because experts are getting things wrong, and we're seeing how they're changing their views and how they're responding. I think, one of the reasons why I think in the US, they were reluctant to recommend that everyone wear masks in, say, February, despite there was the early report of asymptomatic transmission. Then there was that one case that people were debating, did that person have symptoms or not? When she gave it to the executives in Germany, it went back and forth. And then she's like, well, maybe I was a bit sick. And so then people are like, well, see, it wasn't asymptomatic. Okay. But one of the things that I think the precautionary principle shows is how tricky this is, because the US, a lot of people argued against wearing masks because they didn't think they had enough masks. So they wanted to save the masks for the healthcare workers. So they told everyone else, don't wear masks because we need the masks for the healthcare workers. What they didn't understand was that, suddenly there'd be this cottage industry of homemade cloth mask wearing, cloth mask making. My sister has made hundreds, literally hundreds. I think she's over 1,000 now, cloth masks that has blossomed all over the country to do this sort of thing. They were sort of thinking about N95 masks and the fact that, you need to have those expert fitted. There aren't very many of them. We should really save them for the healthcare workers. So for some people, it was precautionary to tell people not to wear masks, to save those masks for the healthcare system. On the other hand, it would be sort of generally health protective precautionary to say, wear masks. And I think that this is partly complicated by the fact that of one's views of the supply of the masks. Are there enough masks? In cultures where, that had dealt with SARS, had a lot of people had masks. Mask wearing is normal, was a normal part of the culture when one is sick to, sort of protect the broader health of the public. And so those cultures transitioned really quickly to wear masks, super easy. Everyone has them. This is no big deal. So if you look at Singapore's response or South Korea's response, very quick mask wearing. But the US did not experience SARS in any kind of significant way. And this is the first time in modern history that people have been wearing masks generally. So there is this kind of what is an expert assessment of what's the cultural backdrop and what would be precautionary. In addition, I think this shows experts do get things wrong. And one of the things that should engender our trust in experts in the future is that they correct, right? They don't keep saying, don't wear masks. Once it becomes clear there's asymptomatic transmission, and that even, sort of homemade cloth masks, if they're not just loose weight jersey, you have to have the right kind of cloth, apparently. But, that makes a difference, that actually improves the suppression of the transmission rates. So these are the sorts of shifts that are really important for the assessment of expertise. And we've seen this happen over and over again from, which kind of treatments might work for people, like remember hydroxychloroquine, and how there was this one guy in France who's like, look, it's gonna, greatly save people. And then people were like, yeah, we don't think you have enough evidence yet. This sample size was low. And some people, like our president, took it up as, look, hydroxychloroquine is going to save people. Take it. What have you got to lose? And people were like, well, it actually is really dangerous if you take this drug. And in some cases, it can damage other organ systems. So, and then it turns out it's not very effective, right? Like when broader studies are done. So, time to check back with that original expert. Have they changed their mind? Or are they, no, this is still the cure? Or, have they sort of taken on board the evidence that's criticism? So yeah, super interesting times to be following and tracking expertise. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, sort of.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Sharad. Mohan, you have a question?
Hi, Tarun, can I go last?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Darshi, do you want to ask a question now?
Okay, actually, I wanted him to go first before me. Okay, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I had a major connection problem and a power failure, which is very unusual in Mumbai. But so I made my question may be irrelevant. Then you need not answer it. So you're talking about trust, and if I just take it as a statement, we trust science, and then the talk is mainly on the trust maker, and I'm wondering more on the side of the trust bearer. The object of the verb trust, I have no problem with science, but the subject position of we. So I'm wondering what is the domain specificity of we? I mean, minimally, it is philosophers of science, right? In the talk, we're gonna question the or talk about the expertise of the scientists. So it would have to be minimally something like philosophers of science, community of philosophers of science. And the problem I see is the more you expand this domain, the broader you make this domain, the whole enterprise would sort of go away, because they may not be in a position, if we make it like the whole, the whole population of the world, right? Make it global. The more global we make it, the more we're going to lose the whole enterprise of what will be the, we won't even have the minimal expertise. That's what I'm trying to say. And at the same time, I think you need to make it more global. So I think there's the kind of a dilemma I see. Sorry.
So that was exactly why I made sure to analyze bases of trust, to ground trust in ways that didn't require expertise, right? Because that's too hard. We can't all be experts. In fact, it's self-defeating to have the division of labor of expertise and then say you have to become an expert to know whether or not to trust an expert. That can't be the right answer. It's really problematic. But so how does the non-expert trust the expert? That was the sort of the whole thrust of the talk. The beginning of the talk, I tried to lay out the data that suggests that actually most people do trust science most of the time. So we're not starting with a massive trust deficit. It's not like most people do not trust their politicians most of the time, but they do trust scientists most of the time. So what is the basis of this trust? And how can scientists continue to cultivate and support and ground public trust in their work? That's part of what I'm trying to articulate here by showing how the non-expert trusts the expert. What is the basis for that? right? And I'm sorry you had power failure. I'm pretty sure that all this is recorded, so you can go back and see how I did that.
Okay, thanks, Darshi. All right, so since the only other person who hasn't asked a question yet is Mohan, and he has expressed a preference for going last, maybe I will step into the queue here and ask my own question before coming to him. I think when you have issues, and these are the cases where evaluating trust in scientific communities becomes especially important when you have a kind of political disagreement getting connected to a scientific disagreement, right? Like with climate change and so on, and now apparently with masks in the US. I think there's a complication here because you enter this kind of sort of game theoretic terrain where the scientists have to be careful about how they communicate with the public because they understand they're entering into this kind of adversarial situation where certain aspects of how they communicate will be taken advantage of by people with an interest in devaluing scientific expertise. And one of the places where I think this appears is in expressing uncertainty, right? So when you try to convey uncertainty in a kind of nuanced way, in climate change, for example, climate denialists will often pounce on expressions of uncertainty to argue that, look, if you actually read the papers, they're saying that there's only this much certainty in this, and now they're asking us to, have policy based on this uncertain science. And so one consequence of that is that scientists often, I think, in public communication, tend to downplay the degree of uncertainty that they would express in scientific communication. Now that on your assessment of how we should evaluate trust in scientists might suggest we should have less trust in them because in some sense, the kinds of explanations they're offering to the public aren't reflective of the kind, so there's a kind of violation of scientific integrity maybe. But it does seem that it might be a good idea from the perspective of scientific communication, right? So I guess, how would you resolve this kind of issue?
Yeah, so when you already have a politicized context and the science is already being fought over, this is already going to be more complicated. And then you have to decide, are you really going for a long-term gain or a short-term gain? Because if you're going for a short-term gain, then sort of like, packaging information to reduce the expression of uncertainty and, to make things seem like, for sure, might seem like the right thing to do. You might get people to do things better, what you want to do. But if it turns out that you're mistaken at all, if it turns out that you have to walk any of that back, you've dug yourself a hole that there's a trust deficit now, right? And trust deficits are very hard to overcome. So I would sort of suggest that I think it's probably wiser to pay attention to the long-term game. And that means being really sort of clear about what's going into the judgments that you're making, and that the fact that there are judgments, and the fact that you do have expertise to make those judgments, but there's still a fact of judgment. And then the longer term game is to get the idea that there is uncertainty, or to get the idea that there is a necessary component of judgment in science to be normalized. So it is not a reason to forestall policymaking. And I think one of the advantages of today's crises is it's now very clear to the public that you don't not act because there's some uncertainty. That's crazy, which of course it is. We know this from our daily lives. A little bit of uncertainty or some uncertainty doesn't paralyze us from acting. And it shouldn't in the case of science, because science isn't like a textbook, right? And so if science is an ongoing practice of inquiry, then uncertainty is normalized, judgment is normalized, and those aren't reasons to not act. And then we might have political fights over when to act and how to act, right? But that's actually where the debate should be, and not about what the scientists are telling us, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I am on board. Thanks. Mohan, so you're the only person now who hasn't asked a question yet, who has a hand up. So would you mind going now? Yeah.
Hi, thanks, Aaron. Professor Douglas, to begin with, thank you so much for that awesome talk. That was really cool. Fan of your work. So this is not so much of a very good question as much as an incoherent ramble, which is why I wanted to go last. So bear with me for like 30 seconds. I'm trying to put it out there. Okay, so it's something like, so your system of trust in experts, scientific experts, is asking me to do a certain amount of work in trying to figure out who is the scientist that, or the set of scientists, the community of scientists that I can trust based on the different values that you laid out. Now, to do that as a layperson, I do need some amount of information that I might gain from like journalism or listening to talks or something. And now here is where I am a bit confused. And this is kind of like a bad rehash of the argument against institutionalized knowledge, or knowledge from institutions in general over the last many years. So let's say that I listen to some experts, and those are my professors and the newspapers that I'm reading, the columnists I'm following, in getting these values that I can use to judge which scientists or which kind of scientists or systems of thinking or journal I should trust. And I have come to my conclusions about, okay, this work is great. I can trust Fauci when it comes to the pandemic, so on and so forth. And now suddenly somebody comes and levels the critique at me that the people I used to come to my evaluation of the scientists I decided to trust, as well as the scientists I decided to trust, are all part of, are all steeped in some kind of, let's say, political ideology or some kind of religious ideology. And so right from my decision to trust these scientists, I was mistaken, and all of this is in fact just in service of an ideology. Now, how do I then protect myself? Or let's just say, how do we still trust in the people that we decide to trust? Yeah, sorry. Any thoughts about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is the question, what to do with conspiracy theorists, I think, right? Like at the end of the day, like, or like the idea that, you know, there's some deep state ideology. So right now in the US, it's QAnon, right? Like, do your own research. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And this is sort of, what do you do with someone who raises this critique? So first you need to ask them, like, what is this specific ideology? And then you might say, like, okay, what evidence do you have that this is actually an ideology? But then you want to ask them, what evidence would persuade you that this is not going on? That there's no sort of ideological cabal driving this. And, you know, you can also think for yourself, what would convince you, and you'd have to, this is why you have to have a specific sort of ideological cabal. It can't just be like general, because that's mush. What would convince you that actually they were under an ideological cabal control, right? And then make the debate about that. What evidence would persuade your criticizer to change their mind, and what evidence would persuade you to change your mind? I would suspect in most cases, the evidence that would change your mind is not available anywhere, even though it's clearly like articulable and would happen, right? Like there would be that evidence out there if this were the case. It puts the criticizer on the back heel of being able to say, okay, what would show you that this conspiracy does not exist, that this cabal, this ideological cabal does not exist, that this is, you know, what it looks like on its surface, which is, you know, scientists agreeing or disagreeing. You know, if they can't say, oh, well, they'll never let you know. Yeah, so in other words, no evidence would change your mind. Okay, well, then this is no longer a question of, you know, evidential. Your research is irrelevant to it. All you've done is, you know, decide based on your particular ideological predilection that this is the way the world is, and evidence is completely beside the point. Because if evidence can't change your mind, then evidence is irrelevant. And so that is the kind of like discourse back and forth that I would pursue. And when I've used this in particular cases where I've actually had students or interlocutors, I used to work in Tennessee, and there were some creationists. And I'd say, great, like, so what's the design, right? And like, what evidence would convince you that the design is not actually in place? And they would be like, well, okay, wait a minute, there's like a real thing here. This would make it scientific. You have to actually posit a design and then figure out what would actually be evidence against the design. And they'd say, well, what about for evolution? What would posit, make evolution problem? I say, well, okay, if someone dug up a T-Rex dinosaur with a human skeleton inside of it, presumably some T-Rexes, if they're the same time as humans, would eat humans. That should be a thing. Or like, a gazillion other things that messed up the evolutionary timeline. And I was like, as soon as they do that, like, I'll change my mind. And they'd be like, huh, okay, I see how this works. and their views would soften. It was very interesting to sort of see this happen. So I think this is a way forward in these cases where it feels like we can't get any sort of traction.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a good answer. I have some thoughts, but I'll probably email that to you. Also, talking about creationism, there's like a creationist museum in Cincinnati, and they actually, have you been there? They actually have some hypotheses of why humans and dinosaurs coexisted with evidence and stuff. It's really cool. Yeah, I'll send you a link.
Cool.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mohan. Prashant, thanks for waiting patiently. You can ask your next question now.
Yeah, I think that's a very selfish thing I did there. So I don't think it's a favor on anyone. But yeah, I'm just more worried about Shinod, that I'd be like blocking him for some time, I guess. Is that okay, or I can wait for Shinod to ask?
No, I mean, unless
no,
assuming
go
you're
ahead.
not going to ask a 10-minute long question, so you can go ahead and ask.
Right. So essentially, a lot of people have already covered great chunks of what my second question actually is. So the hypothesis with which you begin your presentation is that trust in science equates to trust in scientific expertise. Well, this is in my very, I don't know, I'm not an expert, or I'm just a very basic BSc student in psychology. I don't have much exposure to philosophy, so to speak. But in my opinion, this seems like the premise upon which the entire presentation rests upon. Now, like people have pointed out, it doesn't look like trust belongs to the domain of straight, conscious, rational thinking. It looks more like it depends on factors that are sometimes quite unconscious, things that people are not aware of how to modulate. Because if they could probably, design or implement the kind of design that they want to implement in trusting someone, this presentation is excellent, so to speak, if they were systemic, etc., etc. But what it seems to me more like is that trust becomes extremely ideological. So there's this one example that Zizek very often quotes. He says that there's this one time when Niels Bohr went to his country house, and another fellow scientist came to visit him, and he sees this small horseshoe hanging on the door. And this other scientist asks Bohr, okay, dude, are you like superstitious or what? So Bohr replies back, apparently, I'm not so sure how true this is because I'm just trusting Zizek with this. So yeah, so Bohr says, no, I'm not stupid, I'm a scientist, right? So I've heard that these things work, whether or not you believe in them. So now this is how Zizek illustrates ideology essentially. He says that, okay, this is a false belief, but people don't acknowledge it's false or that it's a belief in the first place. So when it is beyond someone's conscious purview, so to speak, how could one address this? That is one question. And I'm so sorry, but the second question is actually quite intertwined with this question. So I feel compelled to ask the other one too, if you don't mind.
Yeah. All right. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So the university that I study at, it's called University of Hyderabad. So you see there's this extremely grand building. It's called School of Life Sciences, so to speak. So you see certain laboratories which would be working on subjects like molecular biology, so on and so forth. But you see swastika symbols on the door. Not Nazi swastika, but more, Hindutva swastika. So while this also contests the premise that you're talking of that, trust in science equates with trust in scientific expertise, because I don't know if they're expertise, they might be experts in their domain. I'm not even thinking about that. But when someone seems to me to be religious, a certain incident is what I'm reminded of, and automatically my trust in them just gets cancelled away. So this one nice lady that I met, she was doing her MSc in microbiology, and she was a devout Muslim. Now, so I asked her, so what is your opinion on creation? You know, how did creation come into existence? And she said the same old Adam and Eve kind of story. So like, aren't you a student of science or what, you know, whatsoever? What do you write in your exams if someone asks you this? She says that, I just tried the Darwinian theory and so on and so forth. And so I asked her, don't you think that there's certain need for these things to, you know, not contradict each other? That you can't be two different selves. I see that a lot of people don't feel a certain necessity to be non-contradictory in their beliefs. Or for that matter of fact, I don't think people even examine their beliefs so much. So that pretty much becomes a part of my question, the second question, which to further extend probably becomes this: that what if we are living in a society of spectacle? You see, how do we theorize trust, or you know, how do we guide trust, so to speak, in a society where it is more of a circus going on? It's people just want to be entertained.
Yeah, so okay. There's a certain sense in which what I'm doing in this talk is saying what I think trust in science should be grounded on, right? Whether or not, in fact, it is grounded on these things, what the sort of moral psychology is, what actually the affective state of trust is, I have no idea, like, what is actually forming people's beliefs about things. But the factors that I discuss seem to actually be central in both the gaining and losing of trust. So in the US, for example, African Americans trust medical science significantly less than white Americans because of the Tuskegee syphilis study, where African Americans were used to follow the course of disease and were lied to about whether or not they were receiving treatment. They weren't. And so this all came out in 1972. It's the reason why we have institutional review boards for human subject study. And ever since then, there's been this massive trust deficit. You know, and the abuse of African Americans in the American scientific system goes back into the 19th century, you know, with horrific gynecological experiments on former women who were Black slaves at the time. And so there's this sort of trust deficit because the scientists did not have the interests of this community at heart. Like, expressly not. They were like just used as human beings. And I think this speaks to your question about, you know, this building that you at your university and the role of institutions in trust as well, which I didn't speak to, except, you know, a little bit at the beginning, because institutions are, well, first of all, they're really badly theorized philosophically. So it's really hard to know what to think about institutions. But institutions are these places that, you know, both direct and channel our efforts, but are still built out of the individuals who work there and are shaped by the individuals who work there. And so there's a sort of complicated relationship between the individuals and the institutions that they work at. And I'm speaking as someone who has worked at now 4 different institutions tenure line. And the reason is because I was not fitting in institutions and institutional culture and the right institutional culture. I think I finally found the right institutional culture for me, so I'm very happy about that. But this does mean that there's sort of this, institutions do serve as a backstop, but part of that is about the values that are instantiated in the institutional practices and the way in which institutional culture is shaped. For your colleague who has sort of religious belief, you know, sort of held here and scientific belief held here, this to me isn't surprising, given that the bases for these 2 different kinds of beliefs about the world are so different. You know, I don't believe in the sort of non-overlapping magisteria thing. I think they're completely different epistemic stances. So you could think one thing based on, you know, hard-nosed evidence and think one other thing based on faith. For example, I have the faith that humanity will not completely screw up the world in the next century. I think this is a statement of faith because when I look at all the evidence, it doesn't look good. You know, like, I'm sorry, but like, you know, a hard-nosed look at the evidence on this question of the trajectories of humanity, the sort of way in which we're using up resources, the way in which we burn through the ability of the earth to sustain us. I just think, like, you know, a hard-nosed assessment would have to be like, wow, we are done. But I have a daughter, and I cannot move forward with that belief. And so I believe, as an act of faith, that we won't completely destroy.
I'm really sorry to interrupt here.
What's that?
I'm really sorry. Am I audible? Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm really sorry to interrupt here, but I totally get your stance about the future of humanity, but I'm definitely not contesting that. What I'm contesting here rather is about something that's quite different in nature, I guess, when I'm talking about creation. So this woman who has, it's just ladies who has done her MSc in microbiology, she vehemently thinks that Darwinism is just a theory, it's just a model. And you know, she totally believes that some agent put two human beings up here. You see, I think that there's a problem with making a certain kind of analogy that you're making. I feel, I might be totally wrong about it, but the kind of faith that you're placing in the future of humanity, I think it still has it's more of a gray area than to speak of what I'm speaking here. I think that at least a stance like this requires a certain I don't know, rigorous examination of beliefs and a certain kind of more or less black or white kind of a decision about what you want to believe in or what you believe in, essentially.
Yeah, so I actually think that it's more useful to think of beliefs that are based on faith as being very different than beliefs that are based on scientific inquiry and evidence. And so that there are two very different stances with two very different bases. So both myself and my colleague are, you know, believing something, you know, in the face of evidence. Now, she might not be willing to acknowledge that her belief is based on faith. I don't know if you talked to her about it that way, that, you know, she's going to believe this regardless of the evidence that's available to her. And I think, you know, each of us has something that we believe regardless of the evidence. And I think the important thing for rationality's sake is to acknowledge that fact, to say, like, okay, this is what this base is believed on. And it's not based on careful inquiry. It's not based on scientific practices. It's not based on, so it's based on this other thing altogether. And as such, evidence is going to be irrelevant. That's the sort of really take-home message. You believe it's based on faith, evidence is irrelevant. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you make it that case, I don't think this is a fundamentally irrational way to believe anything in particular. I tend to, like, you know, not want to believe, like, I'm not a deeply devout Judeo-Christian person in that sort of tradition, and so I don't believe that the Bible is literally true in any sense. And so I don't, you know, like, have those sort of predilections. But for people who are in those systems and who take a great deal of personal sustenance from being part of a faith community of that kind, I can at least understand why they might think that. Now, I think it was a mistake for them to then think everyone else is irrational for not having that faith. So this is sort of like a pluralism of systems is super important, and to recognize your beliefs that are based on faith, and to recognize that not everyone's going to share that faith, that there's going to be divergence, and that it's not a matter of, like, rational argumentation and debate based on evidence who's right at that point in time. As soon as faith-based beliefs enter the picture, it becomes about, you know, what sort of is emotionally and communally sustaining for one sort of path in life, which is a very discussion about what is a result of scientific inquiry.
Excuse me.
And I think people should, you know, be able to, you know, if her work in microbiology or molecular biology doesn't depend upon Darwinian theory, I mean, at some point in time, it very well might. But, you know, I could imagine people doing certain kinds of work that it doesn't depend upon this. Well, fine, you know, more power to her. She can do the science and then have her faith.
I think I should probably clarify on my stance.
Prashant, I'm sorry to cut you off, but the discussion is about.
I'm really sorry, Tarun, but it's just like it felt like my idea is being miscommunicated. So
okay,
if you could just
can
give
maybe
me a few
clarify
seconds.
over email or something. We have another question that someone's waiting
Fine.
for.
If she's okay with me waiting.
How about you send me an email?
Yeah, you can send Heather an email and maybe talk about it over that. Yeah, all right, thanks. Yeah, Shinod, go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi.
Okay. Yeah, part of the your repertoire in showing the value neutrality of science is an effective employment of the problem of induction to show that there is endemic uncertainty in most scientific decisions. It's a part of that procedure. That part I readily accept, but what I find a bit confusing in Evers as well as Orozco's white trust science is that this aspect endemic uncertainty has given much importance, while at the same time when I look at it, the scientific work through kind of a lens of Nancy Cartwright, what I have in mind is that old work, How Laws of Physics Lie, where we have the phenomenological relations mostly intact. The empirical relations hold between certain values. So that kind of stays with us even when there are paradigm changes. So I think this we could, I know this is one need to fine tune this domain and the range in which we get these phenomenological relations intact. But can we take this as something that science correctly hits upon, even when theories change and our explanation for the phenomenological relations change?
So is there like some sort of underlying empirical stuff that just stays the same even as the theories change on top?
Yes, my empiricist commitment is kind of pushing me to believe that these empirical relations, because this seems to be something that is retained over theory changes, the empirical relations, pressure and something, temperature. One could contest that, but no.
They can be, but they can also not be. I mean, I think this is sort of Kuhn's point, that with, you know, big theory change, sometimes the underlying description of empirical phenomena also change in ways that, you know, we have to give things up. So for example, the classic case of phlogiston going to oxygen, right? Clearly oxygen was a superior theory for understanding the weights of metals that are sort of put under heat and how they gained weight instead of losing weight. But when you moved away from phlogiston theory, you no longer had an explanation for why it was that metals were shiny and ductile and malleable. And we didn't get that for over 150 years. You know, like it took a long time to get that back. Not until the early, you know, around the 1920s and 30s when we had sort of quantum mechanical theories of metals did we get that back. So, you know, it's a long time to just sort of be like, well, we used to have an account for this phenomena, but now we don't. Yeah, you know, we still know that metals are this sort of characteristic, but we don't have a theory of why. We don't have an explanation for why. We don't have any account. And then, you know, if you look at sort of Hansen's work on the theory of lateness of observation, you know, he suggests that it goes all the way down. and so there's part of me that's like, well, clearly the empirical phenomena that we still take with us, we see that as always having been there back to the point where it was initially discovered. But there's all kinds of empirical stuff that we then let go of and we forget about. And sometimes, like, thank goodness, like, you know, beliefs about women's ability to do math, let's get rid of it. Or, you know, theories about, you know, sort of racial differences and cognitive differences. My goodness, we need to just like get rid of that junk. So these sorts of things that we forget can often be like hugely valuable to forget. and to set aside and just be like, that was garbage. It was never any good. And let's throw it out. So I find it very complicated to sort of try to figure out, like, is there like an empirical thing that stays with us? And the only thing that I think we can, say with confidence stays with us is a sort of very practical ability to intervene in the world successfully, which ends up being about technology and practice, very much outside of science. Like that, we can take electricity and turn lights on, and then computers on with it, and then run an internet with it. Oh my goodness, that we can use solid state transistors to run computers, to run the internet. This is like, clearly a sense of progress that we can feel secure about. But even Hacking, who sort of pointed us this mode of intervention back in 1983, makes it clear that that doesn't mean the theory's right. So, it's this sort of like tactile ability to intervene in the world that stays with us, I think, over long periods of time, and that we can build upon. But that's not so, that's not just like an empirical basis, nor is it a, theory basis. It's this other thing about sort of intervening in the world.
Okay.
Hey.
All right, thanks, Sharod. Okay, so with that, I think we've come to the end of our session, unfortunately. I'm sure there's others who want to ask other questions, but we are out of time. Thank you very much, Professor Douglas, for joining us, for taking the effort to record that video and that excellent talk, and for being with us for such a long discussion. We really appreciate it. This was a great session. And thank you all for attending, those who stuck with us for this entire time, and also those who are no longer here, who left at some point. And I'd also like to just briefly thank the other people who played crucial role in organizing this. Shinod, Dawn, who is playing the video, Shahana, who has been recording videos and updating the website, Prajit for helping us out in many ways. And yeah, I hope to see you all next week as well. We'll have Professor Elliot Sober joining us. Yeah, so I hope to see you all then. And
thank you so much for organizing this. I really enjoyed this. This was great fun.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. All right, everyone, see you next week.